Christmas tree up?
We're putting the Christmas tree up, yes, because we're those people that do it before Thanksgiving now, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's okay.
Which I think that's okay because
Okay.
how close it is getting to Thanksgiving and Christmas.
You want to tell everyone what's on the Christmas tree in your room?
A star, I think.
Well, yes, a star. What else?
Cubs ornament.
Cubs ornaments. What else?
A bunch of stars.
Bunch of starships. You were saying right. You were getting to the answer. So, you want to tell everyone Happy Thanksgiving?
Happy Thanksgiving.
All right.
No, I just kicked something on your
Yep.
keyboard.
And I was trying to kick off the computer.
Because he got stage fright. And Gertie's laying on the bed.
All right. Everyone, welcome back. Actually, I just realized if you look in the, I'm going to try and point. If you look back here, you can actually see our cat hanging out in the bed in here. So welcome back. We're going to do chapter 16, just to kind of to go back to talk about where we were before. Absalom, David's son, has claimed the throne of Israel. And as such, now David is fleeing, which David fleeing honestly sounds like such a common trait that seems like he's fleeing a lot. But we see him again fleeing here, and we're going to go through all of chapter 16. It's not a hugely long one, but we're going to go through it. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness." The king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore me to my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan of Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops in the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, "Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin. You are a murderer." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But the king said, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" David then said to Abishai and all his officials, "My son, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjaminite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him so. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me to his covenant blessing instead of his curse today." So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all his people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Meanwhile Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. When Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king, long live the king." Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the chosen one by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the Lord? Just as I served your father, so will I serve you." Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. This was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So As we kind of turn here, what we see here is that sorry, looking at something real quick as I'm getting trying to close this up. Um, Give me just a minute. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I was looking at a name on one of the notes I had here. So what we see here, just kind of going back to follow up what we talked about, is we are still in the process of David fleeing, and really we kind of have three. Uh, excuse me. Um, we have three kind of separate stories. Excuse me again. I'm hoping that's the last one. Um, we have three stories here, and so we're going to kind of break them down here. And we actually hear the first part of this is kind of a going back in time, and actually two of these will sort of resonate with some of the previous stories we've heard. So the first one we hear about is Ziba, and we hear about Ziba, and then his servant or his master that he's the steward of, Mephibosheth. And if you remember, right, this is Jonathan's son. King Saul's son Jonathan had a son Mephibosheth, and he had been disinherited, or at least didn't have his Jonathan's possessions. He had been crippled during the fleeing after Jonathan and Saul had died, and then David restored him and said, "Sit at my table with me," and gave him everything else. Ziba, if you guys remember the story, Ziba was the one who was a servant of Saul, servant of Jonathan, and said, is there anyone of the house of Saul that I can still help? After kind of given, saying, listen, I promised Saul that I would take care of his children, promised Jonathan I would. And Ziba said, yes, there's still a son of Jonathan, and that was Mephibosheth. I'm sorry if it's a little convoluted, but just to remind you of where Mephibosheth came from, and also Ziba. And so what we see here in the beginning story is we see that Mephibosheth has immediately, despite all of the good that David had done for him, had betrayed David, and has left thinking that he's getting ready to be restored as king of Israel. Now, if you're sort of scratching your head of why he would think this, since Absalom took the throne, as a reminder, and that this is just purely my theory, is remember that Absalom went to Hebron and declared himself king. Now, if you remember in what we talked before, Hebron was capital of Judea. And so maybe Mephibosheth, remember, clarity is not clear at this time. They don't have cell phones, they don't have TVs or anything to understand exactly what's going on. Mephibosheth may just be thinking that Absalom's trying to take control of Judea, not all of Israel. And as a result, he may actually be thinking that, okay, well, if the kingdom is getting split and one of David's sons has taken over just Judea, not all of Israel, I'm going to take over Israel. Or he's being opportunistic here, and he's betraying a man who has really helped take care of him in the most recent years. He's betraying him for this potential for something he has really wanted, apparently, thinking he's going to get restored as king. And this is something that I think, on a day-to-day basis, we've witnessed, maybe we've been a part of in one way or another. But people get certain dreams in their head, whether they're reasonable or not, and depending on what the dream is, there's a lot of times that we quickly betray or at least ignore or neglect the people that we're with, as in that process. And so we need to be really careful, especially if we think that there's a blessing coming to us that's going to put us to the next level in some way, shape, or form. We need to be really careful that in that process we don't tread on the people that have loved us and known us and taken care of us and been with us throughout all the difficult times. There's an old saying, you dance with the person who brought you, and that's not a perfect saying here, but that has a little bit of the resonance here. Is that you know when we think about our lives, we need to also make sure that as we're growing and whatever it is we're growing in our lives, that we don't sit there and just tread over top of the people who were with us during our toughest times. It's really easy, especially as we grow in life. Friends change over time, different periods of our life, different people are more prominent. And that's okay. That happens. But we do need to remember all the people who have blessed us and taken care of us as we go. And Mephibosheth here saw a grand opportunity, and he completely forgot about what David did. Now, in return, David said, Ziba, whatever was Mephibosheth's is now yours. And Ziba, it humbly bows and says, may I find favor in your eyes, and he's blessed. Now, what's I think ironic about this is David is blessing this, but remember, David likely doesn't have the power to actually give give Ziba these possessions, and so Ziba is really actually determined on by faith that David will be restored. He has that type of uh, faith, and that's pretty good faith given the fact that it probably at this time we know David's restored later on, but probably at this time it didn't feel guaranteed, and it probably felt very unlikely that he was going to be going to be restored to his throne. But Ziba nonetheless is loyal. He remembers what David did for Mephibosheth and sees the righteousness of it, and he sticks with David, and David in turn takes care of him. Now we get to the next part, and we hear about this man named Shimei. He's part of Saul's. He's part of the same clan as Saul's family was, and he is cursing David as he goes, and throwing stones at him, and throwing stones at the people. Even though really he probably knows that this is dangerous, and that's what David I think alludes to. Listen, if he's willing to throw these in front of all of us, then obviously, he feels like God's telling him to do it. But someone actually tells David, let us take care of this guy. Let us cut off his head. And David says, no, let him speak. If God told him to speak like this to me, let him speak. Were are we to stop him? And so, in some ways, I think what's interesting here is David's not shirking away from um, the curse that he's done. I've seen people in business and in life that when something has gone wrong continues to deny that anything's wrong, even while they're sort of proverbially fleeing in disgrace, the way David is. They will deny that anything's wrong. And the people that I've seen that are more successful, more emotionally mature, more faithfully mature, they have no problem acknowledging when, man, they made a mistake and they're really paying for it now, and they don't deny. These are people that don't deny that they did something wrong, that something went wrong, that things are not going their way. They acknowledge it. I don't want to say they embrace it, but they acknowledge it, they absorb it, and they look forward to what they can do next to move forward. And that's what it feels like we see here is David saying, if God is telling him to say these things to me, to throw stones at me, let him. I am in disgrace right now. I am fleeing. He's saying nothing that doesn't seem like it's true right now. That's almost what it seems like David's saying. And so he listens to it, he absorbs it, he lets it happen, and he doesn't seek vengeance on the person that is giving him this sort of curse. It's giving him this negative message. And likewise in life, we shouldn't either when we live in life. Now, the last thing here, and we'll back up a little bit again, um, is we have now this discussion of Ahithophel and Hushai, and we'll see them a couple times. They'll be in this chapter and they'll be in the next chapter. Um, but we see, Absalom comes into Israel, comes with all the men of Israel to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. And if you remember, David asked in the last chapter, sort of said, "May his advice become foolishness." That's kind of what he said. And then we hear about Hushai the Archite, or yes, Archite. I pronounced that correctly. Sorry. Who was David's confidant, and he went to Absalom, and he sort of tries to get in good with him. Now remember, Hushai's kind of there, um, for lack of a better term, he's there as a spy for David, and also to sort of try and throw confusion, throw some disorder, make it more difficult for Absalom to rule. But that's what Hushai's there. So he's sort of like he's an informant, he's a spy to sort of throw off Absalom as he's taking into his reign. Because do remember, Absalom's newly established in his throne. Nothing is guaranteed at this point in time. The fact of the matter is while he may feel like he has all the people of Israel, anytime you're you're leading a coup, especially over someone like a pretty well-established king like David. Nothing's set in stone, and so good advice is critical. And David knows that. If Absalom makes a mistake at this point in time, it will cost him likely his throne and his life, and that's what we see here. Or that's eventually what's going to happen. So Hushai comes in and gets in the good graces of Absalom and and gets in good with him. Now, um, Absalom then turns at the very end of this, and this is another pullback to a previous chapter, or at least has some resonance to it. Absalom says to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" And he says, "Hey, you remember those 10 concubines that your dad left here to take care of the palace? You need to sleep with all of them, so that you become," he says, "obnoxious to your father, and that everyone else will see that you're obviously king." Now, I'm not one to criticize the wording of the Bible, to be clear. But this is one of those areas where I don't know if it's my translation. I just didn't find a translation that to me makes a little more sense. They've said it a couple times about being obnoxious. And so in some ways, like it's almost like he's saying, "Hey, sleep with the 10 concubines. It's going to taunt your dad, and everyone's going to think that you're really awesome in the country, and it's going to make everyone more resolute with you." Now, the part that they're silent on, or at least that they don't really say, is something that we also talked about in an earlier chapter, and this is why I'm saying that this has a little bit of resonance to it. If you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 3, we have a very similar situation, but a different house. And if you remember, we at this time we had Abner, who was sort of the right hand man. He was ruling the kingdom for Ishbosheth, who was Saul's son. This is, remember, David was ruling Judah at this point. Ishbosheth is ruling the rest of Israel, or at least trying to tentatively hold it. Now Abner kept getting stronger and stronger, and the last sort of thing he did, and the last mistake he made with Ishbosheth, was he started sleeping with one of Saul's old concubines. Now, as we discussed in that particular lesson at the time, this was more than just being obnoxious or falling in love. This is actually, by tradition at this time, a way to challenge the throne and to say that you are wanting to be king, or that you are king. It's a way to sort of show your own sovereignty over the king. And so while verse 21 in particular might be talking about sleeping with the 10 concubines um, to make their dad feel obnoxious or feel taunted, and to show everyone else that you're more resolute, what it's really doing is it's sort of sealing the challenge that Absalom is making himself king. And I think that's something that the chapter is a bit silent on, but I think critical for us to look at. And so what we have here is Saul takes the, or not Saul, I'm sorry, Absalom takes the advice of Ahithophel and sleeps with the 10 concubines that David left, and is now sort of showing his challenge or his taunt to David that he is now the ruling king. And um, and so what we also know is, remember that Ahithophel is the one that we talk about that David hopes, God will make his advice foolish. And obviously, I think what we must see is that this must have reverberations. I don't feel like in the chapters as I've read them later, we see this reverberation, but I'd say there's an undercurrent that this backfired in a way that Absalom just was not planning on. And so, what we have here is we have Ahithophel now starting to give foolish advice to Absalom as he's establishing his own kingdom. And remember, this early on, an established kingdom is easy to topple, especially with the former king still living, and the former king still actually armed with, granted, a smaller group of army people, but pretty well-established veterans, loyal veterans, who are going to stay with them. So we do need to remember that as well. That we are in a very tentative position for Absalom. We're in a tentative position for all of them. But what we see here is we see sort of the first set of advice that is probably not the right one. So as we finish today and we think about these 3 stories, what are some of the things that on a day-to-day basis we should remember is the first part is remember, from Mephibosheth, we don't want to act like him. We don't want to just forget and walk away from the people who were there with us at some of the toughest times of our lives. Those people are loyal, honest people. It's righteous to help honor them and serve them and not abandon them, especially in their time of need. Which is what's even so much worse about this is that when Mephibosheth was at his worst, David came in and gave him all the possessions and land that Jonathan had, and when David was in the same position, Mephibosheth decided that he wanted more and that he was going to try and make himself king of Israel, which he doesn't, but he thinks he's going to. And then what we hear in this middle area is we should never we should never just shirk ourselves away from bad news or our own mistakes or when we're just in a bad position. We need to acknowledge it. We need to, I don't want to say embrace it because embracing bad news is not the right thing, but we need to take it to heart, need to understand it, need to admit to it, and move forward as we go. And then kind of in the last part here, is there a good lesson here? I'd say don't be obnoxious. Don't do so. If the choice you're making is just to make someone else obnoxious, that's a really bad idea. Nothing good comes from that. Um, and we just really shouldn't do that. I will say this: it's easy for us to be obnoxious, especially when we don't like someone, or especially if we're trying to spark the person into doing something. But that doesn't make it good advice. It doesn't make it a good thing to do. And so we just need to stay away from it. So as we close out, like I said, I think this is an interesting chapter. We got some really neat chapters as we go forward, especially as we kind of go through this, I guess, for lack of a better term, civil war. But what we see kind of at this position as we leave here is David's in a tough spot. Um, the thing that I think I want to close with is just remember the faith that David still had at this point with the covenant that God gave him. If we go back to, as we close, the one final thing is about having faith, even in our toughest times. I think one of the most interesting things is when, in verse 4 here, David actually says to Ziba, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. As I said before, that wasn't probably in David's authority to do at this time, physically speaking. He probably could not say, literally give him all this stuff. It was likely in the possession of Absalom and his people. But David kept faith, even though he's fleeing. David kept faith because the fact of the matter is he gave something that he could only give as the king, as the ruling king. And so he knows that while he may not have the authority now that he would, and so he still makes that promise even in this. And furthermore, Ziba himself also keeps the faith with David and knows the righteousness of David and says, may I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king. And so we see here that David in his toughest spot seems to at least understand or at least have faith that he is king, even though he doesn't have his capital city or his country and he's fleeing. But he still had the promise in the faith of the covenant that God gave him. We need to, in our toughest times, always have faith in that covenant that God's given to all of us. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the covenant that you've given us through your Son, that we can be forever in your presence, that you've forgiven us for our sins, so that we can be reconciled to you. Help us to be humble followers of you in whatever way, and help us that no matter what, no matter the toughest times that we have, help us to keep the faith. Help us to spread that faith to others, to widen the people who serve you that are in your presence. Help us to follow that each and every day. Please watch over everyone if they're traveling, where they're traveling to. Let everyone have a good Thanksgiving, and let us just have a good Thanksgiving all around everyone out there. Please watch over all of us and help us to be able to come back and serve you again each and every day. And we ask for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you guys. By way of announcements, just remember we have church every week at 10:45. So please do that. And then also as a reminder, we'll be back here again next week at 6. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Wherever you're going, be safe. I hope you have a great dinner, and that you get to spend some time with some wonderful people in your lives, and be thankful for all the things that you have. Um, and we'll see you again here next week. Thank you.